Magic is real. No, you can't conjure fireballs or grow magic wings, and the people who say they are witches do not have the supernatural powers to accompany that claim. But the magic that a child experiences in the build-up to Christmas, the anticipation of Santa Claus and the promise of experiences never before seen amid the year's best festivities, that is magic. Magic is experienced strongly by children, but by adults too, provided they have not shut themselves off from it. It is a tragedy of our times that many adults do. Magic is part of the realm of the ideal, those perfect and strange things that can only live in imagination. Magic is part of religion too, where it dances with ritual and custom in a highly prescribed way. Most of all, magic is part of fantasy.
You're a wizard, Harry.
The Wizard of Oz is an early American fantasy, with 4 witches and 1 charlatan wizard. A prequel was written by a different author, and has since become a popular musical in Broadway and the West End, called Wicked. When I first saw Wicked, in about 2008, I remembered it not as fantasy, because the fantasy elements were largely sterilised. I remembered an interesting and thought-provoking take on the idea of racial intolerance in society. It was social commentary. They got a lot wrong, but for something written by Americans who generally have a poor grasp of the dynamics of different peoples and long histories, it asks some worthy questions. I later attempted to read the book, which was irredeemably dreadful. And I soon realised that Wicked's idea of racial intolerance was nothing to do with the author's imagination, but instead lifted wholesale from the zeitgeist of American politics. Contemporary politics is a toxic starting place for a fantasy story because politics and magic do not mix. Where magic inhabits the ideal, politics is a cynical denizen of the real, whose business is the liquidation of all illusions in the pursuit of power. In a story of magic and politics, the magic is reduced to an alternative physics system and isn't really magical at all. It soon transpired that every story coming out of the American tradition was the same story. The clumsy, moralizing tale of racial injustice, of cardboard-thin victims persecuted for their identity by a cruel society, etc., etc. You know the drill. This dirty great political meta-narrative had somehow taken over the literary establishment. I presume it was all one big competition between writers and publishers as to who could most obviously signal their virtues. And this was long before I'd heard of diversity, equity, and inclusion. But you could smell the bad storytelling a mile away. It was a real turn-off. The invasion of diversity advanced on many fronts, as its university-educated ideologues poisoned every hobby they could find. Their attack on video games, in the name of praxis, has often been considered the first skirmish in the culture war, though only because the gamers had the bad grace to fight back. The enemy was already abroad, much like the ringwraiths marauding across the Shire, as Gandalf rode to Orthanc. Magic the Gathering cards are a good example. Instead of featuring a particular race or civilization from fiction, each expansion showcases the diversity. The diversity is a fantasy race in its own right, neither elf nor orc. They possess an arrangement of skin tones that's roughly comparable to a California slum, and a quota of unaesthetic body shapes that can only be the product of criminally bad diet or aggressive hormone therapy. Wherever the diversity shows up, it takes you right out of the immersion and brings your suspended disbelief crashing to the floor, because you're no longer looking at a fantasy race of elves or a brotherhood of knights or even a civilization of humans. You're looking at an American racial propaganda project. And you can make a number of predictions about the diversity civilization, because they follow the same political meta-narrative. They will not be patriarchal, and the darker-toned characters will tend to be good, brave, intelligent, industrious, or cool, while the lighter tones are often warped, stupid, pathetic, or evil. The same troll logic applies to men and women, or boys and girls. One has clearly been marked out for denigration, while the other has a halo and wings painted invisibly around their character. Again, immersion explodes. This is not world-building, it is the message. The Black Elves of Amazon's Lord of the Rings showcase this perfectly. Although Magic the Gathering has been doing the same thing for years, The Lord of the Rings is the fountain from which high fantasy springs, and so its desecration is all the more despicable. They have stripped away everything about elves which is elven, to the point where they look like men and women at a low-budget cosplay convention. Elves are inherently magical creatures, but the showrunners have no magic in them. They are prisoners of a world of material realities, the world of stuff and physics, money and economics, demographics and statistics. In short, the world of politics. As a result, they have something of the gift of Midas. Every time they touch something, the magic drains out of it, and having blinded themselves to storytelling magic, they don't even notice. The diversity can never be elves, just as they can never be dwarves or hobbits, or even Numenorians. They will always be the diversity. A shapeshifter, an evil cradling, a monster from beyond the realm of fable, wearing its once magical creatures as a skin suit. Terry Pratchett once famously likened Tolkien's influence over fantasy to that of Mount Fuji over certain genres of Japanese art. It is either the subject of the painting, or it looms prominently in the background, or its omission is by itself a noteworthy artistic choice. With this in mind, the deliberate desecration of the Lord of the Rings by filling its world with a new fantasy race, the diversity, is appalling. It is the aesthetic equivalent of demolishing Mount Fuji. Of course, if Mount Fuji were demolished, the Japanese people would lose almost nothing of material value. On every rational line of argument, it would be hard to oppose the demolition if there were enough financial backing for the trucks and diggers, and especially if defenders of Fuji could somehow be painted as bigoted, backwards, or otherwise horrible people. But the quiescence of the Japanese people in this scenario would lead to an inestimable loss of cultural symbolic value, the loss of the physical and aesthetic talisman that has played such an integral part in Japanese culture for millions of years. Losing Fuji would be worse than losing both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Clearly, the Japanese would not allow this to happen, and we would be monsters for even suggesting it. If Amazon are not demolishing Fuji, they are at least daubing a gigantic, ineradicable Amazon logo across its peak. They have not come to Tolkien to make money. Amazon already makes $1.5 trillion per year, more than many countries. They have come to colonize Tolkien, and to claim dominion over the entire land of fantasy fiction that stretches out beneath his works. But Tolkien is an English writer, and his work is a self-avowedly English story, written in imitation of the epic cycles of Finnish and Germanic myth. Amazon's attempted colonization of this national literature is an attack against English culture on an unprecedented scale. It is a crime beyond crimes, an assault by vulgar materialism against meaning, myth, and magic. If there is one thing worth fighting for in this world, it is magic. The wonder and innocence of children at Christmas time, the hope of better things. Perhaps there will be protest parties at Amazon's filming sites across England, where people gather in chilly but determined celebration of Tolkien's works, causing endless delay and frustration to the directors. Maybe there will be a festival of Lord of the Rings art so that people share far and wide to preserve the spirit of high fantasy. Or perhaps there will even be sabotage or violence. But we all know this. There is no place for the diversity in fantasy, nor the message, nor Amazon Prime. Resist the subversion of magic.